continuing chapter 1, what makes things alive. Tried to tilt this so you're not seeing quite so much of the imagery on the ceiling. When I look back through, I'm going to try to stay a little bit closer so the sound is a little bit better. Is that it becomes an issue because if I step and block too much, is it does weird things with the light. But so when we last left chapter 1, we had gotten through internal organization. There's a lot of stuff having to do with internal organization. Is the protein chemistry and the DNA coding and the cells and the levels of complexity and all that other stuff. But now we're going to the next thing on the list. Energy. Energy makes things happen. It's a horribly difficult thing to define in any kind of usable way. And actually, you'll see books where, energy does work, whatever that means. But we do use energy. We take in energy, we move it around. And every time we move it around, we change it from one form to another. Sometimes it's a matter of changing it from one type of energy holding this molecule together to one type of energy holding that molecule together. That happens a lot in our transformations. But we do that. We use it, we move it, we lose some of it. Every time you move energy from one place to another, it doesn't all go. Some of it kind of fritters away as heat, which is basically random chaos energy. Is that it doesn't disappear, but you don't get as much in the next second step as you got when you started. Is energy always fritters away with every transformation. We all depend on the first level. That starts with some sort of energy available in the environment. Things that do first level transformations take energy from the environment and use it to stick carbon atoms together in molecules, usually a simple sugar called glucose. 6 carbons stuck together that didn't used to be stuck together before energy came from the environment and was transformed into bond energy where it's stored and used for later. And then it moves from one type of bond to another type of bond. There's 2 basic types of first level transformations. It turns out there's more than 2, but the other ones are so weird and rare that we're not even talking about those. The most common type of first level transformation is photosynthesis. It's what plants do. They take the energy from light and they transform it into energy holding glucose together. Now it turns out that's not the only way to do this. There's other types of environmental energy that can get used. And later when we talk about how life all developed, is that this was one of the big sticking points for everything that people knew way back when, like half a century ago. That's not way back too far when. All of the ecosystems used photosynthesis as their first level transformation. It was the only way to get energy, which is fuel, into the system. And nobody could come up with a way where the system could have just kind of jump-started immediately with photosynthesis. Too complicated. Then they eventually found some rare hidden ecosystems where this is the bottom of the food chain, and heat is used to move the molecules or build the molecules of glucose. Much simpler process. I'm oversimplifying it by saying it uses heat, but it's basic biology. I gotta oversimplify stuff. You'll see me hesitate a lot of times where I'm going, well, this isn't really the way it works, but this is the way it's understandable. Bottom of the ocean, where new ocean floor is being made. The continents are moving apart. You need new floor in between them. And in those cracks, the water mixes with hot magma coming up to fill in the cracks. And there are whole ecosystems that live along those cracks. They're called hydrothermal vents. Hydro for water, thermal for hot. And they are way down in the ocean, far below where the light will reach. But you have whole ecosystems there based on chemosynthesis. And once they discovered that this was a possibility, then it started to make sense where the very first types of first level transformations were based on heat, a much simpler starting point. And then you had to get to photosynthesis from there. We'll talk about that later in the semester. But these are first level transformations. The environmental energy into the internal energy of chemical fuel. Well, there's a first level, there's other levels. Cells, to do stuff, they need energy. They need energy to build things, they need energy to move things, they need energy to do all sorts of things. And the energy that they use starts with the energy holding those molecules together. We can do it with glucose, we can do it with proteins, we can pull a bunch of things apart, and the energy that used to hold the atoms together is then moved over to something else. This second level transformation is usually some form of respiration. Sorry about the weird spelling, the capital L in glucose. There's something about writing on overheads where it's real easy to screw the letters up and leave letters out. You'll see I'll misspell stuff, which I don't generally do writing or typing, but I'll do it here. Usually I catch it. So this energy that you get from the first level of transformations is good for storage. Glucose is pretty stable, is that you can move it around, you can store it, you can stick a bunch of glucoses together and store it that way. But eventually, you need to use it. You're going to get fuel, you got to use the fuel for something. And what you do is you break the glucose apart, which is not the easiest thing in the world to do. So it's often done in very dedicated areas. And then that energy is moved into a much more usable, easily broken down fuel. There's a bunch of different molecules for this, but in an awful lot of living things, almost all living things, you'll find a molecule that's called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. It's got a string of phosphates on it. The phosphates are stuck on pretty well, but not super tight. So it makes the molecule stable enough that you can get it places, but unstable enough that you can pop the phosphates off and use the energy to do stuff. Sometimes just pop the phosphates onto things to destabilize them and get them to do things. But so there's more usable fuel molecules. It's not a great comparison, but it's kind of like the difference between the crude oil that bubbles up out of the ground, which you can't really burn in your car, and the gasoline that we convert the crude oil into that's more of a usable fuel. Not a great metaphor, but kind of works. term that goes with all of this is metabolism. We talk about, oh, I got a high metabolism. What does that mean? I burn off a lot of calories. Burning off calories is using fuel, is using energy, is that, and the rate at which you do that is your metabolism. That's metabolism for you. But we, like the other things where we talked about populations and communities and stuff, we could look at the metabolism of a single cell in your body. We could look at the metabolism of one of your organs. We could look at the metabolism of a population of living things in an ecosystem. Is that every time you're using the term metabolism, you're kind of taking a step back and looking at the energy using processes in that system. You could take a certain type of chemistry in a cell and just track the energy there and look at the metabolism of that. Incidentally, before we go on, respiration can use oxygen, doesn't have to use oxygen. Very late in this semester, we'll talk about aerobic respiration, which is very efficient, uses oxygen, gets a lot of energy out and into ATP. And anaerobic, non-oxygen using respiration. There's a whole bunch of different types of that, used by a whole bunch of different living things, some of which live in you. And it's all respiration. This is, I know, is respiration, but not to a biologist. A biologist is this process that happens in the cells, moving energy from a very basic starting fuel molecule into something more usable. Next thing on the list of living things. No, it's not. Some terms. Well, these will come up later, but these are kind of an introduction. See, moving letters out. The first level transformers in an ecosystem, the ones that can grab the heat and make glucose, the ones that can grab the light and make glucose, those are the fuel makers. They're called producers. In most ecosystems that you'd be familiar with, in fact, pretty much all of them, these would be plants. Everything else needs its fuel made by the producers. So below the producers, or above them, depending on how you write this, are the consumers. And you can be a consumer and eat the plants. You can be a consumer and eat the things that eats the plants, or eat the things that eats the thing that eats the plants. I mean, if you're eating a burger, you're a first level consumer when you're eating the lettuce and the tomato. You're a second level consumer because you're eating a cow who ate grass. If you're eating a fillet of fish, you're like a 10th level consumer, depending on what the fish is. But fish big enough to catch very often are way up the food chain, many, many, many levels of consumers up the food chain, and you're eating them. So we're not going to worry about levels of consumers. There is a special type of consumer we are going to talk about, though. Every time you move energy from one place to another, from one individual to another, from one level in the ecosystem to another, you lose energy. Eventually, it fritters away. Better still have that light in the sky or the heat coming up out of the ground as a starting point energy, or the whole system's going to grind to a halt. But you got to build stuff. You need raw materials to build living things, and that's got to be back into the producers. Producers are grabbing, like plants grab carbon dioxide and water. Where did carbon dioxide come from? Well, it's a breakdown from consumers. Consumers take the glucose, break it down, you get carbon dioxide. What happens to all of the consumers? Well, they die, or they incompletely process food and dump it out. You need a level of consumers that are specifically in the recycling business, that really do the final breakdown so that the producers have something to build. These are things like bacteria, they're like certain types of insects, they're like molds and funguses. So they are consumers, they're using stuff that fed up the food chain to them, but they're a special type of consumer. They recycle the materials. The energy doesn't get recycled. The energy, as soon as you've broken all those molecules apart and you get the carbon dioxide back, you don't have the energy you started with, it's gone. It's either stored in other things or it's frittered away. It's mostly frittered away in the environment, but you don't recycle it. Living things, the Calvin and Hobbes cartoon where the food, he's fighting with the food. I mentioned that it's one thing it's doing as a living thing is it's interacting, it's responding to him. That's a basic product of life. Living things interact with their environment. They have to take in raw materials, they have to break, some of the stuff they break down, they don't want to hang on to, they got to get rid of that. Is that if they need to if they're a plant and they need light, they'll respond and get themselves to where the light is best. Is that if there's chemicals put out by a predator, then a prey species may smell that and move the other way, or hide itself, or put up some sort of defenses. But there's all sorts of ways that living things interact with their environment. You know, senses, responses, the whole list. But you can actually figure that out. Living things make more living things. Is that, yeah, you pretty much have to, because you know the odds are you're not living forever. Even things that don't age, trees fall on them and you never know what's going to happen. They get sick. But things that, if you don't make more, then eventually there's going to be no more of you. So you got to reproduce. You got to make copies, sort of. Now, to do that, you need that coding system that we talked about. If our code is in our DNA, all of the stuff we can do, all of our proteins, we have codes for those. Now, my codes may not match your codes. So I may have slightly different codes for slightly different, it's protein that's supposed to do the same thing, maybe it doesn't do it exactly the same way. So there is variation in the chemistry and in variation in the codes. And reproduction is, let's pass these codes on to our offspring, is our babies. Whether it's living babies or seeds or whatever, what have you, we're passing this on to another generation. And in nature, the number of offspring you produce is kind of reverse connected to what their odds are of living long enough to make their own offspring. Is that if your babies don't have great odds of living long enough to make their own babies, you better crank out a whole bunch of them. If they have pretty good odds of living to produce babies, then you don't need to make that many of them. Is our ancestors made more babies than we do. Our system is actually still set up to crank out multiple babies, at least the ovaries are, but because we're really good at keeping our offspring alive, we no longer produce litters. You do, in order to ovulate a single egg, you have to start with somewhere between 4 and 7 every cycle in order to get one healthy one to pop out. So it's kind of a remnant of back when we used to make 4 to 7 babies, but we don't anymore. There's 2 different ways to do this, and they're both called reproduction, but they shouldn't be. We'll start with the one that actually reproduces. Now we're stuck with the term. This will happen in biology. There's a term that's a very old term. It goes back before people really understood what was happening, and we're kind of stuck with it, and it's confusing because it no longer really means what they thought it meant. Like asexual reproduction, reproduction without sex. That's a horrible term for it. And you'll notice I'm going to define it in a way that has nothing to do with sex. Anytime I put a word in quotes, it's a way of saying sort of. Now, they're sort of parents. You wouldn't generally call them parents, but parents gets the idea across. In asexual reproduction, the offspring get exactly the codes that the parent had. So they are potentially copies of the parents. Now, it turns out you may not use the codes the same way. Codes have a lot of flexibility. Like right now, you're not using every code you got. It would kill you to use every code you got. You use certain codes depending on your interactions with the environment. Happens with bacteria too. So things that reproduce asexually only produce code copies. And in some cases, they're not physical copies at all. Think about all of the cells in your body are code copies of one another, pretty much. But they're not all doing the same things because they're not all using all the same codes at the same time. Your muscles use the muscle codes, your bones use the bone codes, your brains use the nerve system codes. Is that this can happen with parents and offspring too, is you can produce an offspring that has all of your codes, but they may behave differently in the environment depending on what the environment is. They may go through stages where they react differently. But this is reproduction. This is honest to goodness reproduction. That's the advantage. If you want to make copies, this is the only way you make copies. One truism about the world is that it doesn't stay the same forever. Conditions change. And if all of your offspring are your codes, then their ability to respond to a new change is pretty much the same as yours was. If conditions change in a way that would be bad for you, it's going to be bad for all of them. That's a huge weakness to asexual reproduction. All have the same strengths, all have the same weaknesses. Now, things that reproduce asexually have a workaround for this. It's not really a part of the definition, but you find it in asexual reproducers, so I'm going to stick it in here. Sometimes I'll ask for a definition and people give it to me as part of the definition. That's not what it is. This is the workaround for the weakness. Asexual reproducers crank out lots and 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 lots of offspring. Why? Two things. It tends to spread them out. And if the conditions change in one's place, they may not change every place that you put offspring. So your offspring have a chance of surviving just because they miss the change that may be killing a bunch of your offspring. The other thing is, you're making copies, but it's a complicated code, and it's real easy to not make exact copies so that your offspring aren't exactly having your codes. They wind up with mutations. And most of the time, a mutation changes the code in a way that really it doesn't do anything. This doesn't really change what you're trying to do. It makes the same protein that does the same thing. In situations where it changes the protein, much more likely to screw it up than to help it, right? Is that if you randomly change a complex system, the odds of you making it better are pretty low, but there are odds that you'll make it better. Again, you crank out huge numbers of offspring, you produce a whole bunch of mutants. The odds of getting one that's useful when the conditions change starts to work in your favor. It's kind of like you want to buy a lottery ticket, one of these mega lotteries. Your odds of winning are very low. What if you buy 1,000,000 tickets? Your odds have just gotten better to have one successful ticket. If you crank out lots and lots of offspring into conditions that are bad for you, if you cranked out 1,000,000,000,000 offspring, maybe one of them is going to be okay in the new conditions. The odds not great, but we make them work because we crank out trillions of offspring. Then you get sexual reproduction, which, again, the definition is going to be confusing. In things that sexually reproduce, they have two matching set of codes. We have two sets of chromosomes. You got one set of chromosomes from your mother, one set of chromosomes from your father. They have genes that make all the same proteins, but they may not have exactly the same codes. You're a mixture of codes from two parents. Well, two parents isn't the only way it works. Is that if you have a chrysanthemum plant, chrysanthemums have two different flower parts that mix their codes together, and they can reproduce sexually all by themselves. And you may go, okay, well, it's still male and female. Well, yeah, but there's a lot of funguses that will share one set of codes and another set of codes. No male, no female. It's just two sides doing exactly the same thing, no separate roles. And it's still sexual reproduction because the offspring are a new mix. They're a new mixture of codes that neither of these sources had exactly. If you could reproduce sexually by yourself, happens occasionally. So we got 46 chromosomes, two sets of 23. As a male, one of my sets doesn't exactly match. I have an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. If I could make sperm and egg cells, I could produce boys or girls. I could produce a sperm with just an X chromosome in it and an egg with just an X chromosome in it, produce girls. I could remix my 23 types of chromosomes a bunch of different ways. You could sit down and do the math, but there's a lot of variety, and that's the big deal. If evolution is driven by changes in conditions that kind of sort through the winners and the losers for the new conditions, then variety is kind of the starting point. There's going to be, individuals whose combination of traits are good for the new conditions, individuals that are bad. The conditions are going to tend to preserve the ones that suit it. They're going to have a mixture that they can pass on to their offspring. Remix it there. Ones that have a bad mixture, not going to survive and make offspring. That's how evolution works. It kind of sorts the winners and the losers as conditions change. If conditions never change, then evolution doesn't really work the same way. And we will talk about that when we get into the nuts and bolts of evolution in a couple of stages here. But the advantage here is that you don't need to crank out huge numbers of offspring to have flexibility for new conditions, to have variation for new conditions. The downside is you can't make copies. No matter how wonderful an individual is, they can't make exact copies of offspring most of the time. There's workarounds there too, but they're not worth getting into. Okay. One other thing having to do with reproduction. When you produce offspring, they don't immediately produce more offspring. They can't. They need to at least put on some bulk, but they also may need to go through a number of different types of changes before they're ready to make their own offspring. Generally, there's growth, generally, there's changes. Growth and development is a very typical feature of living things that's associated with reproduction. Because you can't get to the next reproductive stage without going through growth and development. That's going to turn out to come up later. Okay, so we've gotten through that part of this.